Why was everyone ignoring her at the briefing table? Specialist Reeves sat at the end of the long plywood table inside the dimly lit tactical tent, her hands folded, a quiet discipline masking the pulse in her neck. Around her, voices overlapped radio frequencies, convoy maps, a dozen soldiers discussing routes like she wasn't even there. She wasn't surprised. She'd gotten used to being invisible. To most of them, she was just the driver. The one who turned the key, followed the route, and stayed out of the way when the real soldiers did the fighting. But today felt different. There was something in the air, that tight, static heaviness that always came before something went wrong. Sergeant First Class leaned over the map, his finger tracing the valley route between Fob Thunder and Outpost Mustang. His tone was clipped, impatient. "We move at 0630. 6 vehicles, medical and supply payload. Minimal contact expected." He didn't look at her once. When he finally did, it wasn't acknowledgement, it was an afterthought. "Reeves, you're driving Vehicle 3. Stay in the truck where you belong." Those words burned deeper than the tone. Where she belonged. She nodded without expression. "Yes, Sergeant." It wasn't new, it was just louder this time. Staff Sergeant Williams shot her a glance, a subtle, sympathetic one, but didn't challenge the order. No one did. Ran the convoys his way, and any protest only delayed rollout. Had learned that early. You earned their respect not by arguing but by surviving. Still, when Williams quietly suggested she lead the convoy, said her route knowledge could help avoid known choke points, cut him off. "I want combat soldiers in front, not motor pool drivers." The words echoed like metal on stone, the kind that didn't fade, just embedded somewhere deep. Outside, the Afghan dawn was pale and cold. The wind swept through the compound, carrying dust and the faint metallic smell of diesel. Walked back to her Humvee, her machine, her world parked alongside the others like beasts waiting for command. Her vehicle wasn't special, but she'd spent weeks fine-tuning its systems, learning every vibration, every sound. M1151 HMMWV, Enhanced Armament Carrier. 50 cal turret on top, thermal sight system, thickened plating on the sides. Her fingers brushed the steering wheel, the place where she felt more alive than anywhere else. The seat fit her like it had been shaped by repetition, by purpose. She checked the mirrors again and again, the way she always did. Habit or maybe superstition. Private Jackson, barely 19 and fresh from AIT, climbed into the passenger seat, his uniform crisp, his nerves obvious. "Morning, ma'am." She smiled faintly. "You don't have to ma'am me, Private, just Reeves is fine." He fumbled with his harness. "Sorry, ma'am, I mean Reeves, first convoy for me. They told me I'll be on the gun." She looked up at the turret hatch, then back at him. His hands were trembling slightly. "You ever fired a 50? "Once on the range, not in combat." Her silence was soft, but it said everything. She climbed up onto the hood and opened the ammunition compartment, running a hand along the belt feed. She noticed a slight misalignment in the cradle, probably from transport vibration, and fixed it with a wrench from her side pouch. "The M2's got her moods," she said. "Feed her smooth and she'll sing for you. Jam her and she'll bite." Jackson looked up curious. "You know this stuff pretty well." Lips curved faintly. "I grew up around it." What she didn't say, what she never said, was that her uncle's shooting range in rural Georgia had been her second home. The place where she learned how to drive armored trucks before she had a license, how to read wind through grass, how to strip and reassemble a 50 cal blindfolded. Her uncle had trained private contractors and Marines in vehicle tactics. He treated her like one of his students, not a niece. In an ambush, he'd always told her, the driver isn't just transport. The driver is survival. She believed it. Every cell in her body did. Her father's photo was taped inside the glove box. Master Sergeant Reeves, Army Transportation Corps, killed in Iraq when she was 14. Convoy ambush. RPG hit the lead truck. He tried to maneuver even as his radio filled with chaos. A comms officer had once let her hear the final transmission. Calm voice, controlled. Her father's last words had been directions, not panic. She built her whole life trying to understand those seconds, what he'd seen, what decisions he'd made. Now she was walking the same ground, driving the same kind of vehicle, maybe trying to rewrite what couldn't be rewritten. When she checked the supply manifest that morning, she saw something that made her pause. Her assigned 500 rounds for the M2. Standard. Insufficient. She waited until the others were distracted during pre-check, then quietly transferred 4 more cans of ammo from the logistics truck into her own, 2 under the dash, 2 behind her seat. Her uncle's voice again in her head. Regulations are written for peace. Bring enough for war. By the time the convoy rolled out, the sun had fully crested over the jagged Afghan ridges, spilling light across a land both beautiful and hostile. Dust rose behind the tires like smoke, curling through the air as if the earth itself were watching them. Her Humvee took third position, boxed between command vehicle ahead and another supply truck behind. The radio crackled with the usual chatter, reports from scout drones, weather confirmations, silence from the hills. Kept her eyes moving not on the horizon but on the details, small things, things others missed. A shepherd moving his flock away from the road earlier than usual. Fresh tire marks on a dirt ridge that wasn't part of the normal path. A flash of something metallic on a slope, maybe nothing, maybe everything. She keyed her mic. Convoy 2, this is 3. Possible indicators on the left ridge, 2 clicks out. Fresh movement. His voice came back sharp. Maintain radio discipline unless you have confirmed contact 3. She exhaled slowly, forcing calm. Copy that. The road narrowed, bending into what the locals call Death Corridor, a half-mile stretch of single-lane gravel carved between 2 steep ridges, the kind of place that punished mistakes. She studied it on maps for days, memorized every blind curve. If she could chosen, she'd have driven in the lead, at least then she'd control the pace. But in the third slot she was boxed in, vulnerable. She checked her mirrors again. 6:43 a.m. The morning light had shifted, softer now, filtered through dust. She felt it before it happened, that instinct that soldiers talk about but can't explain. A heaviness in the chest, a sudden silence from birds. Then the world tore open. The first RPG hit the lead vehicle dead center, detonating with a thunderclap that shook the valley. Fire and debris rained across the road. Hands tightened on the wheel instinctively as shock waves rippled through the Humvee. Contact front, someone screamed over the net. Machine gun fire erupted from both ridges, converging streams of tracers slashing through the dust. Training kicked in before thought could. She threw the Humvee into reverse, backing into a turnout she'd noted on the map. The radio was chaos, overlapping commands, confusion, panic. His vehicle stopped dead, blocking half the lane. All vehicles hold position, he barked, voice shaking. Hold position, in a kill zone. Rounds pinged off the ballistic glass. Jackson froze, staring at the turret. I can't. Get down, she ordered, unbuckling. But the gun. I said get down. She yanked him by the vest, pulling him into the footwell. Then, without hesitation, she climbed up through the turret hatch. Dust, fire, and sound hit her all at once, an orchestra of chaos. The M2's handles felt cold under her palms, grounding her. She racked the bolt, adjusted the sight, and exhaled. Through the thermal lens, she saw them, heat signatures moving fast on the eastern ridge. 3 figures with launchers. Her first burst tore through them. 3 controlled rounds, no hesitation. Then she pivoted to the right, another cluster, laying down suppressive fire on's truck. She aimed for the muzzle flashes, short bursts, counting rounds in her head. Her body moved on instinct. Every muscle knew the rhythm. Driver 3 engaging targets East Ridge, she called out, though no one was listening. Time slowed. The air felt thicker. Every vibration, every movement, she registered it like her senses were sharpened to glass. Down below she could see Jackson staring up at her, awe, fear, disbelief. She switched belts mid-fight, smoke curling from the barrel. For a split second, her father's voice filled her mind again. Calm under fire, always calm. Then something shifted. Through the thermal scope, she spotted 3 fighters with radios on the northern ridge command element, the ones directing the attack. She adjusted her aim, walked the rounds across the rock line, and watched the signals go dark. Without leadership, the gunfire on both ridges faltered, became sporadic. She dropped back into the driver's seat, slammed the gear into drive, and pushed the pedal down. The Humvee roared forward alone. Not retreating, advancing. Every military manual said the same. In an ambush, do not charge the kill zone. But manuals weren't written by people who grew up listening to death on a radio. She weaved through craters, alternating between driving and firing bursts from the turret. The vehicle's momentum became its armor, unpredictable, unstoppable. Somewhere behind her, soldiers were still shouting, but the sound blurred. It was just her, the gun, and the math of survival. She'd spent years preparing for this, studying every pattern of every ambush from Iraq to Vietnam. The difference between massacre and miracle was always the driver. And right now, she refused to be transportation. She would be the difference. How long could 17 minutes feel? In war, time stretches. Seconds become decisions. Minutes become lives. For Reeves, those 17 minutes would echo for years, carved into memory, detail by detail, like a scar that never healed. Her Humvee jolted as the tires slammed through loose gravel, the vehicle fishtailing for an instant before she corrected, pushing deeper into the valley's choke point. The radio behind her screamed with static and fractured orders. Convoy 2's hit were pinned. Requesting air we need. Driver 3 fall back, that's an order. But she didn't fall back. She gritted her teeth, one hand on the wheel, the other reaching up for the turret grips. The M2 roared again, sharp, rhythmic, methodical. Her bursts weren't wild. They were cold, controlled. The enemy had set up perfectly. Elevation on both ridges. Interlocking fields of fire. Classic L-shaped ambush, textbook precision. They expected the Americans to stop, to cluster, to panic. But what they hadn't expected was her. Every movement of her Humvee broke their equation. Every second she stayed alive, their plan unraveled. Tracer fire ripped past her windshield. Glass spiderwebbed but held. Her hands didn't flinch. The smell of gunpowder mixed with diesel and hot metal filled the cab, choking but familiar. Private Jackson stirred beneath her seat, covering his head. "What are you doing? We're supposed to." "Breathe," she cut him off, voice calm, steady. "Just breathe." He looked up at her through the haze, disbelief all over his young face. "You're insane." She almost smiled. "Maybe." The engine roared again. Through the cracked windshield, she saw the ridge flash white, another RPG launch. She swerved hard, pressing the brake and accelerator together, forcing the vehicle into a side slide. The warhead hit the road just behind her, throwing a shower of dust and rock into the air. Her uncle's voice surfaced in her mind, calm and instructional, just like when she was 16 behind the wheel of a battered Humvee at his Georgia range. "Never let them dictate the fight, Tash. You drive the gun, not the road. Keep moving, keep thinking." She could hear him even now, like a ghost behind the roar. She braked suddenly, swung the Humvee sideways, and used the slope for cover. Through the thermal sight, enemy heat signatures glowed bright, moving downhill, closing in. They thought she was stuck. She was. She waited 3 heartbeats. Then she popped the hatch again, brought the M2 to bear, and opened fire. The .50 caliber thunder cracked through the valley, echoing like artillery. Each shot ripped through stone and flesh. She didn't spray. She hunted. Short, surgical bursts. Controlled arcs that stitched across the hillside like lightning. The enemy fire wavered, then broke. Her headset crackled again. William's voice, barely audible through chaos. "Reeves, what the hell are you doing? Get back." She cut him off. "Covering your flank. Move the wounded back behind Vehicle 5. Static, then silence. She didn't wait for approval. She knew he'd do it. He was one of the few who trusted her instincts. Another burst from the ridge, 2 more muzzle flashes. She tracked, adjusted, fired. Silence again. Her mind processed faster than fear could catch her. Every field of fire, every sound, every second. The training she'd buried under quiet obedience, all of it surfaced. This was what she'd been preparing for. Her father's voice joined her uncle's now. That same calm from the radio transmission she'd memorized as a teenager. "Keep moving, protect your crew, think before you shoot." She did all 3. With the east ridge temporarily suppressed, she saw her opening. If she could reach a small outcrop 50 meters ahead, she'd have an angle on the northern ridge, where the command element had been coordinating. She didn't have backup, but she didn't need it. She dropped back into the seat, shoved the gear forward, and gunned the accelerator. The Humvee lurched ahead, engine straining. Bullets smacked into the doors, the hood, the reinforced windshield. Metal screamed, but the vehicle kept going. Private Jackson yelled something she couldn't hear. His voice drowned in the roar. Then through the thermal scope she saw it. 3 figures with radios, moving between rocks, giving hand signals. "Command." She lined them up, squeezed the trigger. The gun roared, brass casings flew, and the ridge erupted in sparks and dust. When she stopped firing, the movement was gone. "North Command down," she said softly, half to herself. Without leadership, the rhythm of the ambush faltered. Gunfire became sporadic, panicked. Fighters began shifting position, uncertain who was giving orders now. But they still outnumbered the convoy 6-1. She keyed the radio again. "Convoy, this is 3. Push the wounded back. Do not cluster. East ridge is breaking. Reposition." No response. Maybe they couldn't hear. Maybe they were too scared. She pressed her lips together. "Fine," she whispered. "We'll finish it our way." Her way meant motion. She pivoted the Humvee, engine growling, and pushed forward again, straight into the center of the kill zone. To anyone watching from above, it would looked insane. One vehicle charging headlong into converging fire, dust plumbing behind it like smoke from a comet. But wasn't reacting, she was calculating. Every angle, every shadow, every thermal signature became geometry in her mind. She angled the Humvee so the thickest armor faced the densest fire, then leaned out the turret to fire short bursts uphill. The sound was thunder. The smell was war. When she saw a PKM team reloading near a rock shelf, she didn't hesitate, shifted her aim. 3-second burst, silence. Then the radio cracked alive again, a voice she didn't recognize. Male, strained. "Driver 3, we've got wounded. Need covering fire." "Send coordinates," she barked. "Grid 220 by." She didn't let him finish. She already had it plotted. She swung the Humvee toward that vector and unleashed another controlled burst, suppressing the ridge line until the fire on their position stopped. "Go now," she shouted. "Move your people." No one questioned her this time. Between bursts, she looked up toward the north slope, smoke rising, heat blooms scattered. The ambush was collapsing, but the danger wasn't over. She knew what would come next: desperation. And desperate fighters were the most dangerous kind. She scanned the terrain again, slower this time. Something caught her eye through the thermal scope, a group of silhouettes near a cave mouth, moving boxes, handing off tubes. RPG rounds, PKM belts, mortar shells. Ammunition cache. Her pulse slowed. That was the heart of it, the one vein feeding the whole ambush. Destroy it and the fight would end. But the angle was wrong. To get a clean shot, she'd need to expose the Humvee completely. Open ground, no cover, fire from 3 sides. Jackson had climbed halfway back into his seat now, breathing fast. "What are you looking at?" She didn't answer at first. Her jaw flexed, eyes still fixed on the scope. Finally, she said quietly, "The source." "What?" "Their ammo cache, if I hit it right." He shook his head. "You'll never make it across that field. They'll chew us up." "Maybe," she said softly, "maybe not." She reached under her seat, pulled out one of the extra ammo cans and locked it into place. "Hold on tight." "Tight what?" She slammed the accelerator. The Humvee shot forward, jolting over the rough terrain, engine howling. Gunfire erupted instantly from both ridges, converging on her vehicle. The world became chaos again, explosions, smoke, the stutter of automatic fire tearing through the air. A round punched through the windshield near her head, shattering glass. She felt heat on her cheek, heard Jackson scream. She didn't slow. An RPG streaked past, so close she felt the heat wash against her skin. The blast behind them rocked the Humvee, lifted one side off the ground before it slammed back down. "Armor's holding," she shouted, though she wasn't sure who she was convincing. Warning lights blinked across the dashboard: engine temp, fuel pressure, damage alarms. She ignored them. When the vehicle reached the open flat near the cave, she stomped the brake, swung the wheel and locked the turret forward. The site aligned perfectly with the cache. Wooden crates, fuel drums, piles of munitions. She exhaled once, then fired. The first burst ripped through the crates. The second ignited something volatile. The world turned white. The explosion hit like a wave. Heat, light, sound all at once. She ducked instinctively as debris hammered the armor. A second blast followed, then a third, chain reactions of RPG propellant and mortar rounds cooking off. Fire roared across the hillside, consuming everything. Through the smoke, she saw silhouettes running, falling, disappearing. The ridges went silent. The echoes rolled through the valley like thunder after a storm. For a long moment, she just sat there, breathing hard, the gun barrel glowing faintly red, the world around her reduced to smoke and ash. Jackson's voice broke the silence. Are we alive?" She smiled faintly, though her throat ached. "Yeah, for now." Then she looked out across the valley, at the fire still burning in the distance, at the shattered rocks, the stillness where chaos had been minutes before. She keyed her mic again, voice steady. "Convoy, this is 3. Ambush neutralized, area secure." No one responded for a few seconds. Then William's voice came through, hoarse. "Jesus Christ, Reeves, what did you do?" She didn't answer. She just looked ahead, hands trembling slightly now that the adrenaline was fatting. In the distance, a helicopter thundered closer, support, finally arriving 17 minutes too late. Her Humvee sat at the center of a ring of silence, smoke rising, sunlight cutting through it in thin gold beams. In that stillness, she realized something. She hadn't been driving to survive. She'd been driving to prove something to herself, to her father, to everyone who'd ever said just the driver. Now, surrounded by the ghosts of those 17 minutes, she finally understood what her uncle meant all those years ago. In an ambush, the driver decides who makes it home. Why was it so quiet? The kind of quiet that comes only after violence. Not peace, not yet, but that heavy, suffocating stillness that hangs when the world hasn't decided whether to breathe again. Reeves sat motionless in the driver's seat, eyes wide but unfocused. Her hand still gripped the wheel, knuckles white, the muscles in her forearms trembling from the strain. The barrel of the M2 above her still smoked faintly, a thin gray thread rising into the morning air. Her eardrums rang, a distant, endless tone that drowned everything else. No gunfire now. No shouts. Just the hum of survival, the soft hiss of the cooling engine, and her own heartbeat echoing somewhere in the hollow between shock and realization. She turned her head slowly toward Private Jackson. The young soldier was staring back at her from the passenger seat floor, wide-eyed, helmet askew, face streaked with soot. His lips moved, but she couldn't hear him. The explosion had muted the world. She tapped her ear twice, signaling she couldn't hear. He nodded, swallowing hard. Then he pointed out the window toward the ridges that had been alive with fire minutes ago. Now they were silent. Smoke curled like phantom hands through the rocks. The northern slope was blackened and charred, the cave mouth completely gone, a crater of burning debris. The air shimmered with heat. Nothing moved. She blinked once, twice, as the ringing in her ears began to fade. Then sound returned all at once, the crackle of the radio, distant shouting, boots against gravel. Convoy 3, report status. Driver 3, do you copy? Reeves, do you copy? She took a breath that scraped against the back of her throat. This is 3, she said quietly. Alive, vehicle functional, area secure. Her voice surprised her, calm, almost detached, like someone else was speaking through her. When she opened the door, the desert air hit her face, hot and sharp, tasting of burned metal and cordite. Her boots hit the gravel softly. She stepped out and looked around. The valley floor was unrecognizable. What had been chaos minutes ago was now a graveyard of silence, black smoke curling from shattered rocks, burning debris scattered across the ground. She walked around the front of her Humvee, feeling the vibration of the engine under her palm as she passed. The hood was riddled with dents and bullet impacts, the windshield fractured into a spiderweb of cracks. A round had punched clean through the driver's side mirror. Jackson stumbled out behind her, still shaking. "I thought we were dead," he whispered. She didn't respond. She was listening, scanning, searching for any movement, any sound that didn't belong, her senses still locked in survival mode. Then finally came the voices, distant at first, then closer. The rest of the convoy was moving up the road, cautiously, weapons raised. Sergeant First Class emerged from behind a wrecked truck, helmet off, face pale under layers of dust. He looked at the valley like he didn't recognize it. Then his eyes found her. For a moment he just stared. "You disobeyed a direct order," he said quietly. Met his gaze, expression unreadable. "Yes, sir." He looked past her at the ridges, at the crater still burning near the cave, at the silent bodies scattered in the rocks. "You also just saved every one of us." She said nothing. She didn't feel like a savior. Her heart still beat too fast, her skin still hummed with adrenaline. Her mind hadn't caught up yet. Williams jogged up beside, eyes scanning the scene. "We got medics checking the wounded, couple of shrapnel injuries, but that's it. No fatalities." Turned to him slowly, disbelief in his voice. "None." Williams shook his head. "None." It didn't make sense. The valley had been a death trap. Even with good leadership, half the convoy should have been gone. But somehow, the only vehicle that charged the kill zone had survived intact. Williams looked at her, not with pity this time, but with something else. Respect. "What the hell happened here, Reeves?" he asked softly. Lips parted, but no words came out. She looked up at the smoke rising from the ridge. "They made a mistake," she finally said. "What mistake?" "They thought I was just the driver." Her voice cracked a little at the end, not from pride, but exhaustion. Behind them, medics moved quickly among the convoy, checking for shock, treating burns, wrapping bandages. Jackson sat on the hood, hands shaking uncontrollably, trying to light a cigarette that wouldn't stay lit. He kept glancing at her like she was something he couldn't explain. The helicopter arrived 10 minutes later, dust swirling as it landed. The pilot leaned out the open door, gesturing wildly. "We heard the call for support. What the hell did you people do down here?" No one answered. The radio reports began immediately, coded transmissions, damage assessments, contact summaries. Every soldier had their own version of the story, but all of them led to the same fact. One vehicle had turned the tide. By noon, the valley was quiet again. The bodies had been counted. 36 enemy combatants confirmed KIA, no American losses. Signed the after-action paperwork with a shaking hand. He didn't look at her. He couldn't. That night back at Fob Thunder, the debrief felt more like a courtroom than a report. Sat at the end of another long table, this time across from officers who'd never seen combat but would judge it by paperwork. She recited everything by the book: coordinates, weapon usage, chain of command violations. She told them how she'd seen the ammo cache, calculated her angles, and fired. Her voice stayed level, her tone professional. One of the captains interrupted. "You're saying you advanced alone into the ambush kill zone?" "Yes, sir." "Against orders?" "Yes, sir." The captain exchanged a glance with the others. "Why?" She paused, eyes dropping to the table. "Because the protocol wasn't working, and the enemy wasn't waiting." There was a long silence. The senior officer, a colonel with lines on his face that looked carved by years of desert wind, leaned forward. "How did you know what to do?" She looked up, eyes steady now. "I studied every convoy ambush report I could find, sir, from Vietnam to Iraq. The difference between survival and massacre is almost always the driver's first 30 seconds. He held her gaze for a long moment, then he nodded once. "Understood." When the debrief ended, she walked out into the cool night air. The stars over were sharp and endless. She could hear generators humming in the distance, smell diesel, sand, and something metallic still hanging in the wind. For the first time in hours, she let her shoulders drop. The adrenaline had worn off completely now, leaving only the ache. Her hands trembled when she reached for her canteen. Williams found her sitting alone on a concrete barrier, staring at the horizon. He didn't say anything at first, just sat beside her. "You okay?" he asked finally. She didn't answer right away. Then softly, "You ever feel like your body's back but your mind's still out there?" He nodded. "Every time." They sat in silence for a while. "Requesting transfer," Williams said eventually. "Can't handle it." Nodded faintly. "He'll be fine." Williams hesitated, then looked at her with a small, wry smile. "For what it's worth, I've never seen anything like that. You didn't just survive out there. You changed the entire equation." She looked down at her hands, small, calloused, still smudged with soot. "I didn't do it for them." "I know." She stared back toward the desert where somewhere out there, pieces of burned steel still glowed faintly red in the night. "My father was killed in a convoy ambush," she said quietly. "He tried to maneuver, but his lead vehicle blocked the exit. I heard the recording when I was a kid. He was calm, trying to save them." Williams didn't speak. "I always wondered if he had more time, if someone in another truck could done something different." Her voice cracked, barely audible now. "Today, I think I got his answer." The wind shifted, carrying the faint sounds of the base, laughter from the wrecked tent, distant radio chatter, the constant rhythm of generators. William stood after a while, leaving her to her thoughts. "You earned their silence," he said softly, before walking away. She sat there long after he was gone. When she finally stood, the sky had turned deep blue, the first light of dawn creeping over the mountains. She walked to the motor pool, her boots crunching on gravel, and stopped beside her Humvee. The vehicle was scorched and battered, the paint blistered, the windshield shattered, but it was still there, still standing, like her. She reached up, touched the side of the turret, the cool metal under her fingers grounding her again. Then she whispered almost to herself, "It's over." But it was not really. Because somewhere inside, beneath the exhaustion, beneath the silence, something new had settled in. Not pride, not even relief. Conviction. That what happened today wasn't luck. It was proof that the overlooked could decide history. And that sometimes strength doesn't shout, it just drives forward. Why did the metal feel heavier than the gun? 3 months later, back at Fort Carson, Specialist Reeves stood in formation under a pale Colorado sky, her uniform perfectly pressed, boots gleaming in the morning light. The wind carried the smell of damp earth and cold metal, the kind that always reminded her of early deployments. Rows of soldiers stood to attention, faces expressionless, waiting for the ceremony to begin. She tried to match their posture to disappear among them, but she couldn't, not anymore. Someone had printed her name in headlines. Female driver turns convoy ambush into historic defense, 36 KIA confirmed. The woman behind the 50 cal. She hated every word of it. Command said it was good for morale, that the story of a quiet, underestimated soldier taking charge under fire could inspire others. But it didn't feel like inspiration. It felt like exposure. She hadn't done what she did for glory. She didn't even think about survival, only about not repeating her father's ending. But now, here she was, standing beneath a flag-draped stage as an officer read her citation aloud. Specialist L. Reeves for gallantry and intrepidity in action, while serving as driver of an M1151 HMMWV during enemy ambush in Province, Afghanistan. The words blurred together. She could still smell the cordite, the dust, the burning metal. Could still feel the vibration of the engine beneath her boots, the heat of the gun barrel under her palms. The colonel pinned the silver star to her chest, a small, shining weight that seemed to pull her shoulders down. Cameras clicked. Applause followed, polite but restrained. Her commander shook her hand, smiling too widely for someone who'd never left an air-conditioned office. Outstanding work, Specialist. You've made Fort Carson proud. Thank you, sir, she said quietly. When it was over, she stepped out of formation and into the crowd of well-wishers, soldiers, reporters, even a few civilians from base families. Someone handed her a flag folded into a triangle. Someone else asked her how it felt to be a hero. She didn't answer either of them. By evening, she was sitting alone in the empty motor pool, her award box resting on the hood of her Humvee, the same one she'd driven in Afghanistan. It had been shipped back to the U.S. as a training exhibit. Bullet holes still pocked its doors like scars that refused to fade. She ran a hand along the metal. You did most of the work anyway, she whispered. The wind whistled softly through the open bay doors. Williams found her there, as usual. He transferred to Carson after the deployment, officially for training coordination, unofficially to keep an eye on her. He leaned against the hood beside her, still avoiding the party. Still pretending it's not for me, she said, half smiling. He gestured toward the metal. You know, most people would kill for one of those. She looked at it, the silver star glinting under the flickering light. Maybe that's the problem. He frowned. You mean you don't think you earned it? She sighed. I didn't earn it, I just didn't stop moving. That's not heroism, that's survival instinct. He studied her for a moment. You really believe that? She turned toward him. You were there, Will, you saw what it was. It wasn't courage, it was refusal. I just refused to die. He didn't argue, he knew better. Some things didn't need debate. Still, he said after a pause, you saved lives, you saved mine. Look down, then let's leave it at that. They sat in silence for a while, the kind of silence only soldiers shared, not awkward, just heavy with what didn't need saying. Finally, William stood. There's talk about changing the 88M program because of you, more combat training for drivers, advanced weapons familiarization. You might rewritten Doctrine, you know that. She smirked faintly. Doctrine's just words on paper, soldiers still have to live it. He nodded slowly. You planning to? Her expression faltered. She hadn't decided. Part of her still wanted the uniform, the mission, the sense of belonging. But another part, the part that remembered the silence after the explosion, wasn't sure she could go back to pretending. I don't know yet, she admitted. Some things changed over there, some things didn't. He didn't press. He just nodded once, then walked toward the exit, his boots echoing in the concrete hall. When he was gone, she sat there in the dim light, looking at the Humvee again. That night she dreamed of the valley, Not the gunfire or the explosions, just the silence after. In her dream, she was standing beside the vehicle, smoke curling around her, her father's voice somewhere in the distance saying, "Drive forward." She woke before dawn, sweating, breath shallow. By sunrise, she'd made her decision. 2 weeks later, she handed in her papers and her resignation. Her commanding officer didn't understand. "You're walking away from a career, Reeves. You could be an instructor, a recruiter, even an officer one day." She shook her head. "I didn't join for rank, sir. I joined to learn something. I think I've learned it." The colonel frowned. "And what's that?" "That sometimes the only way to change the system is to step outside it." He stared at her but didn't argue. Maybe he knew she was right. She left the office without looking back. Outside, the base was quiet in the early morning light. Soldiers saluted as she passed, most out of habit, some out of respect. She returned each one with a nod. Her Humvee, the same veteran of the ambush, sat parked near the motor pool gate, waiting for transport to Georgia. The Army had decided to donate it to her uncle's range, as a symbol of tactical innovation. She smiled faintly, fitting. A week later, she was home. The Georgia range hadn't changed much. The same red clay earth, the same scent of oil and powder. Her uncle stood waiting by the gate, grayer now, slower, but with that same sharp gaze. He didn't say anything when he saw her, just pulled her into a tight hug. "Took you long enough to come back," he said finally. "Had to make a mess before I could clean it up," she replied. He grinned. "You always did things the hard way." She looked out across the open field, the targets, the vehicles lined up for drills, the small observation tower where she'd spent countless hours learning to think like a soldier. It felt like coming full circle. The next morning, she stood at the range again, wearing civilian clothes and instead of a uniform. A group of young recruits, contractors, reservists, and a few active-duty soldiers gathered in front of her, waiting. She rested a hand on the M2 Browning mounted on the training truck beside her, the same weapon that had once decided her fate. She started speaking, voice calm, deliberate. "They'll tell you the driver's job is to get the team from A to B. They'll tell you your support, that your job is to move, not to fight." The trainees listened in silence. She paused, eyes scanning them, a mix of nerves and doubt. She recognized it. She once been them. "Let me tell you something different," she continued. "In combat, there are no support roles. There are only soldiers who are ready and soldiers who aren't." One of the recruits raised a hand hesitantly. "Ma'am, did you really take out 36 insurgents by yourself?" She smiled slightly, almost embarrassed. "No, I had help." "From who?" She tapped the side of the Humvee. From training, from the people who didn't believe I could." They laughed softly, the tension easing. Then her tone shifted, quieter now, more reflective. "You can't control who underestimates you, but you can control how prepared you are when they do." For a moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the wind through the range and the distant echo of a bird. Then she picked up her ear protection and gestured toward the mounted gun. "Now, let's make some noise." Hours later, as the last students packed up, joined her at the firing line. "Not bad for your first day back," he said, watching the recruits leave. She nodded. "Feels strange, standing here, not over there." He studied her quietly. "You still dream about it?" She hesitated. "Every night." He didn't push, just said softly, "Then teach until you stop." She smiled. "Yeah, maybe that's the plan." As the sun dipped behind the Georgia trees, she sat on the hood of her Humvee, looking out at the empty range. The medal hung around her neck, glinting faintly in the last light, not as a trophy, but as a reminder. A reminder that sometimes the world changes because someone refuses to stay in their lane. That courage doesn't always shout. Sometimes it just keeps driving forward. And somewhere in the quiet distance, She could almost hear her father's voice again, proud, calm, certain. "You made it home. How do you teach peace when your hands only remember war?" It had been 6 months since Reeves left the army, 6 months since she'd driven through that ambush, 6 months since she'd tried to leave it all behind. But some battles followed you home. They didn't wear uniforms. They didn't fire rounds. They just waited in the quiet. Her range in Georgia had grown busier since she took over. Soldiers came from other states for her training, convoy maneuver drills, vehicle survivability courses, mounted gunnery simulations. Word had spread. They said the Reeves method cut ambush casualties by 30%. She didn't like that title. It sounded too clean, too mathematical. It wasn't a method. It was desperation turned into instinct. She stood at the edge of the range one morning, hands in her jacket pockets, watching the trainees run through a live exercise. Dust hung in the air, the sun climbing higher over the tree line. The rhythmic boom of the 50 cal echoed across the fields. Walked up beside her, coffee in hand. "You're turning this place into something special," he said. She didn't answer right away. Her eyes stayed on the convoy simulation below, 3 Humvees moving through the valley course, flanked by old burned-out shells of vehicles they dragged from surplus yards. "They're still hesitating," she said quietly. "See that driver? He's watching the gunner instead of the terrain. He's waiting for permission." Nodded. "They're learning." "Not fast enough," she muttered. He studied her for a moment, then asked, "You ever gonna let yourself breathe, Tash?" She smiled faintly. "Breathing overrated." He chuckled. "You sound like your father." Her expression softened. "Yeah, maybe that's not a bad thing." Later that afternoon, as she was logging data in the office, a black SUV rolled up to the gate. Out stepped a man in uniform, clean, pressed, too polished for the range dust. A colonel, judging by his insignia. Raised an eyebrow. "Visitors." The colonel introduced himself as Colonel Brent, Army Training Command. His tone was formal but friendly, the kind that hid purpose behind politeness. "Specialist Reeves," he said, shaking her hand. "It's an honor. We've been following your post-service work closely. You've built quite the reputation here." She forced a smile. "Just trying to make sure the next driver doesn't freeze like I did." He chuckled lightly, but his eyes were sharp. "You didn't freeze, specialist. You rewrote the book on convoy survival, which is exactly why I'm here." He explained that the Army wanted to integrate her course into the official motor transport training pipeline. They wanted her to travel, to lecture, to become the face of a new initiative called Driver First Response Doctrine. On paper, it was an honor. In practice, it felt like a trap. "So you want to make me a poster," she said flatly. Smiled. "A symbol, not a poster. You'd inspire thousands of soldiers, especially women. You've already proven what they're capable of." She leaned against the desk. "And what if I'm not interested in being capable? What if I just want to train people to survive?" He tilted his head slightly. "You'd be helping far more people inside the system than out of it. Think about that." She did for 3 days. Every instinct in her told her to stay quiet, to keep teaching in the dirt and the dust where it mattered. But something about his words lingered. If she refused, someone else would take her story, reshape it into something clean and cinematic, remove the fear, the doubt, the smell of smoke that never really left her hair. She couldn't let that happen. 3 weeks later, she found herself standing on a stage at Fort Benning, a huge auditorium filled with recruits. Lights too bright, cameras too close, applause too loud. Her palms itched. Had introduced her as the woman who redefined what a driver could be. When he stepped aside, she faced the crowd. Hundreds of faces, most young, some skeptical, some inspired, all waiting. She hesitated only a moment, then she spoke. "I'm not here to tell you how to win fights," she began. "I'm here to tell you how not to lose them." The room went still. "They'll teach you tactics and drills, convoy formations and weapon ranges. But what they can't teach you, not in a classroom, is what happens when the plan falls apart. She paused, scanning the room. I learned that lesson in 17 minutes. 17 minutes that changed my life and 36 others. You've probably heard the story. What you haven't heard is how many mistakes I made that day. A murmur rippled through the audience. She continued. I froze for 5 seconds when the first RPG hit. I forgot to check my rear angle before the first turn. I almost ran out of ammo because I was counting rounds wrong in the middle of a reload. The only reason I survived wasn't skill. It was training that lived deep enough in my bones that fear couldn't touch it. Her voice steadied as she went on. Don't wait for permission to be ready. The battlefield doesn't care about rank, it cares about reaction. When she finished, the applause came slow at first, then stronger. She nodded once quietly and left the stage. Caught up to her backstage, grinning. That was incredible. You just rewired 1,000 soldiers thinking. She gave a faint shrug. I just told the truth. He looked at her for a moment, studying her expression. You really don't like the spotlight, do you? Spotlights make it hard to see what's real, she said. That night back in her hotel room, she couldn't sleep. She stared out the window at the lights of the base, the silhouettes of training vehicles parked in neat rows. For a moment, she imagined herself behind the wheel again, the hum of the engine, the smell of oil, the sound of radio chatter. It wasn't nostalgia. It was longing. Not for the war, but for the clarity. In combat, things made sense. Decisions had weight. Every second mattered. Out here, the noise was different, endless meetings, speeches, politics. 2 months into the program, she traveled to 5 bases, trained hundreds of drivers. Her message spread faster than she expected. The Army made a documentary. Magazines wrote profiles. News anchors called her the quiet warrior. She hated that too. The truth was, she wasn't quiet because she was strong. She was quiet because she didn't trust words anymore. One evening, after a long day of instruction at fort, she sat in her barracks, staring at the silver star pinned inside its case. She still hadn't framed it. She couldn't. It didn't feel like something meant for display. There was a knock at her door. When she opened it, she found Jackson standing there, older, leaner, his uniform faded from another deployment. Private Jackson, she said, surprised. Sergeant Jackson now, he replied with a grin. Heard you were teaching out here. Figured I'd say thank you in person. She smiled faintly. You already did that, remember, in the debrief. Not properly. He stepped inside, nervous but steady. I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for you. That's not a line, it's a fact. She didn't know what to say. Gratitude still felt heavier than bullets. He looked at the medal on her table. They gave you that for those 17 minutes, but what they didn't see was what came before: the night studying maps, the way you fixed the M2 before we rolled out, the extra ammo you loaded. I saw all of it. You didn't get lucky. You were ready. She swallowed hard. Luck still helped. He smiled. Maybe, but luck doesn't pull a trigger. When he left, she stood by the door for a long time, staring at the empty hallway. Something shifted inside her, something small but certain. Maybe her story didn't belong to the Army. Maybe it belonged to everyone who'd ever been underestimated, silenced, or told to stay in their lane. A week later, she returned to Georgia for good. She turned down the next tour, the next lecture, the next feature, called her 3 times before giving up. She was done being the symbol. Back at the range, she found a rhythm again, teaching, fixing, listening. The trainees called her coach, and it made her smile every time. At dusk, after the last students left, she'd sit on the hood of her Humvee, the same battered metal that had once carried her through fire, and watch the sunset bleed across the trees. Would sometimes sit beside her in silence. Other nights she'd be alone, letting the wind speak instead. She'd think about those 17 minutes, about what they'd cost and what they'd given. She didn't need to relive them anymore. She just needed to understand them. Because the truth she'd learned, the one she tried to pass on, wasn't about glory. It wasn't even about survival. It was about choice. The choice to act when everyone else froze. The choice to step forward when told to stay still. The choice to be the difference between chaos and clarity. And when the world tried to forget, when the headlines faded and the silence returned, she found peace in knowing something simple, something her father had died teaching and she had lived to prove. That dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. Why did she still wake up reaching for the gun? The war had ended for everyone else years ago, but not for Reeves, not in her head, not in the silence. Some nights she'd wake drenched in sweat, heart pounding, the phantom vibration of the Humvee's engine still in her bones. Her hand would search the bedside table for a weapon that wasn't there. The room would be quiet, too quiet, and for a few seconds she wouldn't know where she was, Afghanistan, Georgia, or somewhere in between. Then she'd breathe, slow, deliberate. Ground herself in the sound of the crickets outside, the faint hum of a ceiling fan, the smell of home. It worked sometimes. Other times she'd sit on the edge of the bed, elbows on her knees, staring at the metal case on her shelf, that small silver star glinting faintly in the dark. She never displayed it, never hung it on a wall. It just sat there, a quiet reminder that heroism didn't heal you. It just kept you busy while the wounds learned how to hide. By day she was steady, calm, confident, respected. The range thrived under her direction. Soldiers, contractors, and police units came from across the country to train under Reeves' rules. They expected a legend. What they found was a teacher. She didn't bark orders, she didn't demand obedience, she asked questions. What's your first instinct when you hear contact? Where are your angles, your exits? Do you wait for someone to tell you what to do, or do you already know? Most of them hesitated, few had answers. That's when she'd nod and say softly, "Then let's make sure you never freeze." Her reputation grew, but inside something was fraying. It started small, a headache that wouldn't leave, a hesitation to drive on certain roads, a flash of panic at the sound of fireworks. She'd hide it well, years of discipline made that easy, but saw it. He'd been through his own shadows. He recognized the look in her eyes, that mix of distance and exhaustion that soldiers carried like a second skin. One night he found her sitting alone at the far end of the range, staring at the horizon long after sunset. The training trucks were quiet, the targets covered. The world was still. "You're not sleeping again," he said quietly, sitting beside her. She didn't look at him. "Doesn't matter." "It matters if you're running yourself into the ground." "I'm fine." He gave a small laugh. "That's what your father used to say, usually right before he was." Her jaw tightened. "Don't." He nodded slowly, letting the silence sit between them. Then, softer, "Tash, you've been fighting ghosts for years. Maybe it's time to stop shooting at them and start listening to what they're trying to tell you." She turned toward him. "And what's that?" "That you survived for a reason." His words landed like a stone in her chest. After he left, she stayed there in the dark, replaying every sound, every image that refused to fade, the thud of RPGs, the gunfire, Jackson's terrified face, the silence after the explosion. She closed her eyes. For the first time, she didn't push the memories away. She let them come. The screams, the static, the moment the world went white. And then her father's voice, calm, steady, the same words she'd memorized from the recording. "Keep moving, protect your crew, think before you shoot." She whispered them aloud. Her hands trembled, but for the first time it wasn't from fear, it was from understanding. He hadn't been telling her how to fight. He'd been telling her how to live. The next morning she made a call. 2 weeks later, the first Resilience and Response course opened at her range, not just for soldiers, but for veterans dealing with trauma. It wasn't about tactics. It was about recovery. They trained in small groups, drove through simulation routes, fired weapons under controlled stress, then sat together afterward, talking, sharing, or sometimes just sitting in silence. The first session was rough. Some broke down, some stormed out, but some stayed. And by the third week, one of them, a young Marine named Tors, approached her after class. "I didn't think I could drive again," he said quietly. "Not after what happened but today I didn't panic." She nodded. "That's a start." He smiled. "Feels like breathing again." That night, when everyone left, stood alone on the track, looking out at the dark horizon. For the first time in years, she didn't feel haunted. She felt useful. Word spread fast. Soon, veterans were flying in from other states. Some came just to drive the course. Others came to talk to her. Many cried. Most left lighter than they arrived. But one day, something unexpected happened. A woman showed up at the gate, short, nervous, in civilian clothes. She couldn't have been more than 25. She introduced herself as Corporal Jenna Morales, fresh out of the service. "I read about you," she said, almost apologetically. "They told me you might understand." Nodded for her to follow. They walked along the track in silence, gravel crunching underfoot. The air was cool, the light golden. After a while, Jenna spoke. "They pulled me off deployment after my gunner froze. Said it wasn't my fault, but I can't stop seeing it. Every time I drive, I think, what if I freeze next time?" Listened, then stopped beside the old Humvee. "You won't." "How do you know?" She looked at her, really looked. The same fear, the same doubt, the same invisible wound. "Because you came here," said softly. "And people who show up don't freeze, they fight." Jenna's eyes filled with tears, but she smiled. That day changed something in. She started mentoring Jenna personally, teaching her how to drive under pressure, how to shoot, how to breathe. But more than that, she taught her how to think differently. "The point isn't to be fearless," she said one evening as they cleaned weapons under the setting sun. "The point is to be ready while you're scared." Jenna nodded. "Was that how you felt that day, in Afghanistan?" Paused. "No, that day I wasn't scared." Jenna looked surprised. "You were." "I was beyond scared," said quietly. "That's different. Fear stops you. But when you go beyond it, you don't think, you just become the training." They fell silent again. The sound of metal clicks filled the space between them. Weeks passed. Jenna grew stronger, more confident. She began helping instruct new recruits. Watched her the way her uncle had once watched her, quietly proud, quietly hopeful. One afternoon approached her with a newspaper. "You see this?" She glanced down. The headline read, "Army implements Reeves' Doctrine in driver training nationwide." She blinked slowly. "They finally did it." He smiled. "Looks like your voice carried further than you thought." She looked out at the field, where Jenna was teaching a class how to maneuver through a mock ambush course. Dust rising behind her, sunlight catching on the turret. "Maybe it's not my voice anymore," said softly. "Maybe it's theirs." That evening, as the sun set over the Georgia horizon, she sat on her Humvee again. The same metal, the same scars, the same hum in her bones. She thought about the young woman out there learning to drive forward, about the recruits who'd stopped freezing, about her father, whose lessons still echoed through everything she taught. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the silver star. The metal was cold against her palm. For a long time she just held it. Then she set it down on the dashboard, leaving it there, no glass case, no ceremony, just where it belonged. The sky turned amber, then red, then deep blue. Crickets started singing in the tall grass. The world was quiet. For once, that quiet didn't hurt. She whispered softly, as if speaking to the ghosts that once kept her awake, "We're done fighting now." And in that stillness it felt true. Not because she'd forgotten, but because she'd learned to live with what couldn't be undone. Sometimes healing doesn't come from medals or speeches or doctrine. Sometimes it comes from teaching someone else how to drive through the fire and make it out the other side. Why was she being summoned again, after everything she'd already given? The letter came folded in official gray paper, stamped with an eagle and the words Department of the Army, Doctrinal Review Board. At first, thought it was a mistake. She hadn't worn a uniform in years. She didn't owe them anything. But the wording was clear. You are requested to appear before the board to provide clarification regarding the Reeves Doctrine and its implementation in current combat driver training. Clarification. She read the word 3 times. They didn't want understanding. They wanted control. Found her sitting at the kitchen table that night, the letter open beside a cup of untouched coffee. "You gonna go?" he asked. She stared at the page for a long time. "If I don't, they'll rewrite it without me." He nodded slowly. "Then go tell them the truth, just make sure they listen this time." 2 weeks later, she walked into the Pentagon. Same posture, same calm, different battlefield. The corridors felt sterile, polished floors, controlled lighting, the faint hum of ventilation that somehow made silence louder. She passed soldiers in fresh uniforms, their eyes flicking toward her with recognition she didn't ask for. Some smiled, some whispered. The legend that wouldn't die. At the end of the hall, a young aide escorted her into a conference room lined with brass. The walls were covered in framed mission maps and commendations. A long table dominated the center. Seated behind it, 6 officers, 2 civilians, 1 psychologist. She stood straight as they read introductions, her medal ribbon the only decoration on her plain jacket. "Specialist Reeves," the chair began formally, "we appreciate your presence. As you know, the Reeves Doctrine has now been integrated into multiple training programs. However, we've received reports suggesting your methods are, shall we say, unorthodox in execution." She raised an eyebrow. "Unorthodox saves lives, sir." He smiled thinly. "That may be true, but there's concern that your philosophy, there are no support roles in combat, blurs lines of command, that it encourages improvisation outside of protocol." She paused. "With respect, sir, improvisation is what keeps people alive when protocol breaks down." A civilian analyst leaned forward. "You're saying soldiers should disobey orders." "I'm saying they should think when orders stop making sense." The room shifted uncomfortably. Another officer spoke, a major who'd clearly come ready to challenge her. "Ms. Reeves, we reviewed your after-action report from. You advanced into the kill zone against command orders. A single mistake could have cost multiple lives. Why should we encourage that kind of risk-taking?" She looked at him calmly. "Because I was already losing those lives by following orders." Silence filled the room. She continued, voice measured. "I'm not saying every soldier should ignore command. I'm saying we train people to react, not to wait. Waiting is what kills convoys. Drivers freeze. Gunners panic. Command hesitates. And by the time someone says move, it's already too late." The psychologist spoke next, voice softer. "Ms. Reeves, some instructors say your trainees show signs of hypervigilance after your courses, heightened aggression, mistrust of command. Do you believe your approach might be instilling fear rather than confidence?" "Thought about that. Fear isn't the enemy," she said quietly. "Complacency is. Fear tells you something's wrong. It's what you do with it that matters." The colonel at the center leaned back, fingers steepled. "So your doctrine is built on emotion." "It's built on reality," she corrected. "On what happens when the map ends and the world starts shooting back." For a long moment, no one spoke. The clock ticked softly in the corner. Then the chair cleared his throat. "You've made your point, specialist, but the Army isn't a place for individual philosophy. It's a system, a chain of reliability. Your methods challenge that system." Met his gaze. "Maybe that's why they work." The words hung there, too honest to ignore, too dangerous to endorse. After an uncomfortable silence, the colonel nodded toward the aide. "We'll deliberate. You'll be of our findings." As she turned to leave, one of the younger officers, a captain, called out quietly, "Specialist Reeves." She paused. He hesitated before speaking. "I was in Kandahar the year after your ambush. We used your training modules. My driver made a call during contact, reversed into cover without waiting for me. Saved 6 lives. So, whatever they decide, thank you." She nodded once. "He saved them, not me." Then she walked out, her boots echoing down the hall like punctuation. Outside, the Washington air felt heavy, too clean, too still. She found herself craving dust, the smell of oil, something real. She spent the next few days in a small motel outside the city, avoiding calls, avoiding news. She didn't care what the board decided. The truth didn't need permission. Still, when the letter arrived a week later, she read every word. Following review, the Reeves Doctrine will remain part of the official convoy training curriculum with modifications. The emphasis on driver initiative will be retained. However, the phrase "no support roles in combat" will be reclassified as philosophy, not operational guidance. Philosophy. They'd taken her truth and filed it under paperwork. She set the letter down, staring at it until the words blurred. Then she laughed once, soft, bitter, almost amused. That night she packed her bag and caught the first flight home. Back in Georgia, the range was alive again, engines roaring, students shouting instructions, dust rising like memory. Met her at the gate. "Well?" he asked. "They kept the doctrine," she said, stepping past him, "but not the heart." He smiled sadly. "That's government for you." She didn't argue. Instead, she walked to the far end of the course where Jenna Morales was running a convoy drill. The young corporal stood on the turret, directing her team through a simulated ambush, voice strong, movements sharp. Watched in silence. When the exercise ended, Jenna jogged over, grinning. "We shaved 30 seconds off the last run." Nodded. "You adjusted at the second choke point, that's why." Jenna laughed. "You noticed everything, don't you?" "Not everything," said softly, "just what matters." Jenna tilted her head. "You okay? You seem quieter." "I had to remind a few people in D.C. what quiet can do." Jenna chuckled. "Did they listen?" "Not really." "Then we will," Jenna said simply. Smiled small, genuine. That night, as the range emptied and the sky turned purple with twilight, she sat by the Humvee again. Her old seat, her old ghosts. The stars came out one by one, crickets sang in the grass. She thought about the boardroom, the polished shoes, the sterile air, the way they looked at her like she was both an anomaly and a problem to be solved. She didn't hate them, not anymore. She almost them. They'd never feel what it was like to make a decision that saved someone's life or ended one. They'd never know the strange peace that came after surviving what should killed you. She whispered to the wind as if to her father again, "They don't understand, Dad, but that's okay, I do." The next morning, she arrived early before sunrise. The air was cool and still. She walked the length of the range, running her fingers along the cold metal of the training vehicles. She paused beside the M2 Browning, the one she used for demonstrations. Her reflection shimmered faintly in the steel. "You taught me everything," she said softly, as if to the weapon, to the vehicle, to the ghost of that 17-minute stretch of road in Afghanistan. Now it's their turn. When the first trainees arrived, she didn't give a speech. She just pointed to the vehicles and said, "Drive." She watched as they loaded up, engines roaring, dust swirling behind them. For a moment she saw herself, years younger, smaller, untested, still trying to prove she belonged. And then she realized something she hadn't before. She wasn't teaching them to fight her battles. She was teaching them to end them. The realization was gentle, not dramatic, but it settled in her chest like peace finally finding a home. Later that day, While reviewing footage from the training drones, she noticed one of the drivers improvising a turn, cutting through a flank position she hadn't briefed. It was perfect. She smiled to herself. Good, she whispered. Break the rules if it saves your crew. When passed by, he saw the look on her face and grinned. What's that smile for? Evolution, she said simply. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, sat with Jenna and a few trainees by a fire pit near the range. They roasted coffee in tin mugs, laughter breaking the quiet. Someone asked her the question they always did. Would you do it again? Go back to that day? She looked into the fire for a long moment before answering. No, she said finally, but I'd drive again, anywhere for anyone who needed it, that's the difference. They didn't understand completely, not yet, but one day they would. Jenna smiled. You know, Coach, someday they'll name a course after you. Shook her head. Don't name it after me. Name it after whoever drives when no one else will. The fire crackled softly. The sky darkened into velvet. And as the laughter faded and the night deepened, leaned back, eyes on the stars. For the first time in years, she didn't feel the weight of the metal, or the sound of gunfire, or the echo of orders. Just quiet. The kind of quiet that doesn't follow war. The kind that comes when you've finally made peace with it. What happens to warriors when the world no longer needs them? The years rolled forward like dust over the range, quietly, slowly, but never stopping. The Georgia air stayed the same, humid in the mornings, sharp by evening. The fields filled with echoes of training fire, shouts of orders, and the low rumble of engines. But the faces changed. New recruits came every month, some barely out of high school, some veterans trying to find purpose again, all of them drawn to the same myth, the woman who turned an ambush into a doctrine, the driver who refused to stay in her lane. Reeves never talked about herself anymore. The legend had grown beyond her, and she didn't mind. Legends were just stories that people told when the truth was too quiet to hear. And the truth was simple. She wasn't a hero. She was a soldier who refused to let her father die twice, once in Iraq and once in her memory. That was enough. One summer afternoon was teaching a convoy tactics class when waved her over from the office. His walk was slower now, shoulders heavier. Age had finally caught up to him. "What's up?" she asked, wiping dust from her hands. He handed her a folder. "You might want to see this." Inside were printed pages, a formal letterhead from Army Training Command. At first, she thought it was another invitation. Then she read the subject line. Fort Reeves, Advanced Driver Initiative Facility. She blinked. Fort Reeves. He nodded. They're nomming the new training complex after you. She laughed softly, shaking her head. They spelled it wrong. He smiled. No, Tash, they got it right this time. She stared at the page for a long time. Somewhere deep inside, something loosened, not pride exactly, but closure. The kind that came when the world finally spoke the truth you'd stopped needing to hear. Later that night, she sat outside under the stars with. They didn't talk much anymore. They didn't need to. After a while, he said, "Your dad would have been proud." She didn't answer immediately. She was looking at the sky, the same endless stretch of black and silver she'd seen from Afghanistan, from Colorado, from every place that had tried to break her. "I think he already was," she said finally. Months passed. The range became busier than ever. She started seeing more women among the recruits, young, determined, unafraid to take the driver's seat. One of them, a 19-year-old named Riley Shaw, reminded her of herself. Small frame, big eyes, the kind of focus that came from something personal. The girl rarely spoke, but when she did, it was usually a question that cut straight to the point. "Coach," Riley asked one day, "how do you know when you're ready?" "Thought about that. You're never ready," she said. "You just stop waiting to be." Riley nodded, like she understood something deeper than words. Over the next few months trained her personally, not because she was the best shot, but because she listened. Riley learned the rhythm of convoy movement, the language of terrain, the feel of danger before it showed itself. And one afternoon during a simulation, saw it, the spark, the same one she'd felt in herself all those years ago. The convoy was ambushed during the exercise, simulated, of course. Most drivers froze. Riley didn't. She reversed, cut across an improvised angle, positioned the gunner, and neutralized the threat with precision. When the dust settled, called for a full stop, she climbed into Riley's truck. "What made you move?" Riley hesitated. "You always say, don't wait for permission to save your people." Smiled. "Good, remember that." She didn't tell her that those exact words had once cost her a reprimand, or earned her a medal, maybe both. That night she sat alone on the range again. Same Humvee, same scars, but this time she wasn't haunted by the past. She was surrounded by it in the best way. Every groove on the vehicle told a story. Every bullet mark was a sentence. And together, they wrote something far bigger than her name. The years blurred again. Retired. Jenna Morales took over as lead instructor. Riley became one of the youngest certified combat driving specialists in the country. And she started slowing down, just a little. Her knees ached in the mornings. Her hands shook when she wrote, but her voice, the one that had once silenced gunfire, remained steady. She still ran the morning safety checks herself. Still adjusted mirrors, checked oil levels, and tapped the tires before every run. Because some habits weren't superstition, they were love. One evening, as the sun sank low and the last trainees left, Jenna walked up to her holding an envelope. "You got mail," she said, teasing. "Real mail, not email." Opened it carefully. Inside was a letter on official Army stationery, not from Washington this time, but from Fort Reeves. "We request your presence at the dedication ceremony for the new advanced driver facility, honoring your legacy and contribution to modern military doctrine." At the bottom was a handwritten note. "Your story taught us that courage isn't a rank, it's a decision, Colonel." She smiled faintly. The man who once tried to turn her into a slogan, maybe he'd learned something too. The day of the ceremony was bright and clear. Rows of soldiers stood at attention before a new building of concrete and glass. The sign at the entrance read, "Fort Reeves, Advanced Driver Initiative Center. Drive forward." She hadn't known they'd used her father's phrase. The sight of it hit harder than any medal ever had. When they called her name, she stepped up to the podium, older now, lines etched around her eyes but the same calm fire still behind them. Cameras clicked. The crowd waited. She took a breath. "I'm not good at speeches," she began, voice low, steady. "Never was. I always thought actions spoke louder and sometimes faster. But I'll say this." She paused, eyes scanning the faces in front of her. Young soldiers, old veterans, families. "I've been called a lot of things. Driver, instructor, hero. None of them feel right. I was just someone who learned that waiting for the perfect moment means letting someone else decide it for you. That day in, I didn't act because I was brave. I acted because the alternative was worse." She glanced up at the sky, the sunlight catching her medal just enough to glint once. "You'll all face your own 17 minutes someday. It won't look like mine. It might be a firefight, or a decision, or a silence. But it'll come. And when it does, don't wait for permission to do what's right." She smiled faintly, because sometimes the driver decides who makes it home. The audience stood in silence for a long moment before the applause began, not loud, but steady, sincere. When the ceremony ended, a young recruit approached her, notebook in hand, nervous. "Ma'am, can I ask, what did it feel like that day, when it was over?" Thought about it, about the smoke, the silence, the smell of burning diesel, about her father's voice in her head, about the realization that she hadn't won anything, she just survived. It felt, she said softly, like the world had stopped to listen, just for a second. He nodded slowly, writing the words down like they meant more than she knew. That night back at the range, the wind was warm and gentle. The stars shimmered overhead. The hum of the generator faded as Jenna shut it down. Walked the length of the field one last time. Every step was a memory, every echo a heartbeat from another life. She stopped beside her old Humvee, the one that had carried her through hell and back. The same one she once climbed onto at 19, terrified and furious and unstoppable. She placed her hand on the hood, felt the cold metal under her fingers. "Thank you," she whispered. Jenna appeared behind her, holding 2 mugs of coffee. "Talking to your truck again." "Just saying good night," said with a smile. Jenna chuckled. "You really think it hears you?" Looked out toward the horizon, where the moonlight touched the faint tire tracks cutting through the dirt. "I think it remembers." They stood together in silence, watching the sky shift from blue to black. Jenna said quietly, "When I'm gone, promise me something." Jenna frowned. "Don't start talking like that." "Promise me," insisted. "Promise me you'll keep teaching them the same thing, that no one is ever just the driver." Jenna nodded, eyes glistening. "I promise." Smiled, the kind of smile that carried peace instead of pride. "Good. Then my work's done." Weeks later, when Jenna came to open the range one morning, she found coffee mugs still sitting on the hood of the Humvee. The wind rustled the flags gently. The sun was breaking over the trees. There was no note, no farewell, just quiet. But on the dashboard of that old vehicle, beneath the sunlight streaming through the cracked windshield, was a silver star, resting exactly where her hand used to sit. And written beside it on a scrap of faded map paper were 5 words. "Drive forward, they're ready now." Years later, they would tell her story again, in classrooms, in convoys, in the quiet moments before soldiers rolled out into danger. They'd talk about the ambush, the 36 enemies, the 17 minutes. But the part that stayed, the part that mattered, was never the gunfire. It was the silence after. The moment she chose to move when everyone else stopped. The decision that turned a driver into a doctrine. And somewhere beneath every roar of every engine, her voice lived on, steady, calm, guiding. In an ambush, the driver decides who makes it home. Sometimes legends fade. Sometimes they echo. But the truest ones, the quiet ones, don't speak in stories or medals. They live in motion. And as long as one soldier somewhere still tightens their grip on the wheel and refuses to wait for permission, Reeves will never be gone. Because sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply drives forward.